June 4th, 1944, a calm sea, then chaos. Depth charges thunder through the Atlantic deep. A German U-boat bursts to the surface. Crippled, flooding, abandoned. Within minutes, American sailors board her and seize the enemy's secrets. It would become the first time in more than a century that the U.S. Navy captured an enemy warship at sea. And what they found inside would change the Battle of the Atlantic forever. The Atlantic Ocean. Vast, cold, relentless. In the early years of the Second World War, this was not just a stretch of water. It was a battlefield, a silent, shifting world where death came without warning, hidden beneath the waves. By 1942, the Atlantic had become the lifeline of the Allied world. Every ship that crossed it carried something vital: oil, weapons, food, soldiers, hope. But it was also a hunting ground, a place stalked by the long shadows of steel predators, the German U-boats. To the Allies, they were an invisible terror. To the Germans, they were the sharpest edge of the Kriegsmarine's power. Small, fast, and deadly. The submarines of Admiral Karl Donitz's U-boat arm were built to strangle Britain's supply lines, to isolate America, and to starve a continent into surrender. Each convoy that sailed from an American port was a gamble. Would it reach Britain's shores or vanish beneath the gray water, claimed by a torpedo that no one ever saw coming? The statistics were grim. In 1942 alone, more than 1,200 Allied ships were sunk by U-boats. Tens of thousands of sailors went down with them. The Atlantic had become a graveyard, and the U.S. Navy was determined to change that. When America entered the war after Pearl Harbor, it found itself thrust into an ocean conflict for which it was only partly prepared. The German U-boats, emboldened by earlier victories, pushed westward, closer to American shores. Soon, tankers were burning off the coasts of New Jersey and North Carolina. The war that had once been over there was suddenly right at home. In the first half of 1942, U-boats operated almost unchecked, a period sailors called the Second Happy Time. They prowled the American coastlines like wolves circling a herd. Lighthouses still shone. Cities kept their lights burning. Against that glow, merchant ships were easy targets. Torpedoes struck night after night, and the ocean caught fire. For months, the United States struggled to respond. Convoy systems were still forming. Anti-submarine tactics were crude and scattered. But America learned quickly and soon began to fight back. By 1943, the tide was turning. Improved sonar, long-range patrol aircraft, and new escort vessels began to close the deadly gap in the mid-Atlantic. American shipyards produced destroyer escorts and small carriers faster than Germany could sink ships. And from this effort emerged a new breed of hunter, the hunter-killer group. Built around escort carriers, these fast-moving packs combined aircraft and destroyers into one lethal system. Their mission: find the U-boats, hunt them down, and destroy them wherever they hid. One such group would soon make history, Task Group 22.3. The story of U-505 begins here, with an American task force that hunted the hunters. Task Group 22.3 was commanded by Captain Daniel Feuve Gallery, a restless, brilliant officer who believed in doing the impossible. He was bold, sometimes controversial, but always forward-thinking. And Gallery had a plan. His group consisted of the escort carrier USS Guadalcanal and 5 destroyer escorts: Pillsbury, Pope, Shetland, Flaherty, and Jenks. Each ship had a role. The carrier's aircraft scanned the skies and seas, while the escorts waited below, ready to attack. To defeat the U-boats, the Navy needed coordination, technology, and relentless patience. Radar, sonar, and radio all worked together. Planes spotted from above, ships stalked below. The hunters moved silently through thousands of square miles of ocean, listening for the faintest sound of an enemy screw turning in the deep. But Captain Gallery wanted more than another kill. He wanted to capture a U-boat intact, to seize its technology, its codebooks, its secrets. An idea that seemed nearly impossible. German captains were ordered to scuttle their vessels before surrender. Yet Gallery believed that with precision and luck it could be done. Months of patrols followed. The men of Task Group 22.3 combed the Atlantic, between the Azores and the coast of Africa. Endless gray horizons, days without contact. But they knew the U-boats were still out there, desperate, hunted, but still dangerous. One of them was U-505, a Type 9C long-range submarine of the German Kriegsmarine, commissioned in 1941 under Captain Axel Loh. It had sailed through rough seas and worse luck. It changed commanders, lost crew to illness, accidents, even despair. By 1944, morale was threadbare. The once feared gray wolves of the Atlantic were being driven back to their lairs. Under Captain Harold Lang, U-505 left Lorient, France, for a patrol off the western coast of Africa. It was a long, dangerous mission. Allied aircraft now patrolled most of the ocean. German supply lines were collapsing. But orders were orders. The boat slipped quietly into the Atlantic. For weeks it hunted and found nothing. The sea had turned against the U-boats. Oil slicks and debris marked the graves of their comrades. Every radio transmission risked detection. Every surfacing, even to charge batteries, could mean death from above. Still, U-505 continued its lonely patrol. The crew endured heat, stench, and exhaustion. Inside the narrow hull, men slept beside torpedoes and machinery. Sweat dripped down steel bulkheads. Silence was survival. By late May, they were weary, low on morale, but unaware that their final patrol was nearing its end. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, Task Group 22.3 received new orders. Patrol the waters near Cape Verde, off the coast of West Africa. It was here that fate would bring hunter and hunted together. The Americans had already scored victories. Earlier that spring, they had destroyed U-515, a deadly veteran. Now the crew's confidence was high. They trusted their equipment, their training, and their commander. But they also knew, in the Atlantic, overconfidence could kill. Then came the morning of June 4th, 1944. The weather was clear, the sea calm. Aircraft from the Guadalcanal took off at dawn for routine patrol. Hours passed, static filled the radios. And then a signal crackled through. A sonar contact. At first it was faint. A whisper beneath the waves, but soon the escort USS Shetland confirmed it. A submarine, deep, moving slowly about 10 miles ahead, engines roared. Destroyer escorts turned hard toward the contact. Depth charges were armed and ready. In the combat information centers, tension built with every passing second. The hunters had found their prey, and within moments the calm Atlantic would erupt into the chaos of battle. The sonar pings echoed softly through the steel hull. Each sound returned with its own voice, a whisper from the deep. On the bridge of the USS Shetland, the sonar operator leaned forward, listening intently. The contact was steady now, no longer just an echo. It was real, a submarine. Somewhere ahead, beneath the calm Atlantic surface, a German U-boat was moving slowly. Captain Daniel V. Gallery, aboard the escort carrier USS Guadalcanal, received the report almost instantly. He stood quietly for a moment. The plan he had imagined for months, the chance to capture a U-boat alive, was suddenly possible. Over the radio, his voice was calm but sharp. "Proceed with attack. Maintain contact. Aircraft to assist." The hunt had begun. The destroyer escorts Shetland, Pillsbury, and Jenks accelerated to full speed. Their engines growled as they turned hard toward the bearing of the contact. Every man on board knew what was at stake. Every ping of the sonar could mean death, theirs or the enemy's. In the dark sea below, U-505 moved slowly, unaware that it had already been detected. Inside the submarine, the air was hot and stale. The hum of the diesel engines had been replaced by the soft whine of electric motors. The crew was tired. Many of them had been at sea for weeks, living in near silence. Captain Harold Lang stood by the periscope, scanning the horizon. He saw nothing, only endless water. But above him, death was closing in. The first attack came swiftly. At 11:10 a.m., USS Shetland released a spread of depth charges. Explosions thundered through the sea, muffled booms that rattled the ocean floor. Inside U-505, lights flickered, pipes burst, water sprayed into compartments. Men were thrown from their bunks. The submarine rolled violently as pressure gauges shattered. Lang shouted orders to dive deeper, to escape the bombs that now seemed to fall from every direction. But it was too late. The Americans had found their range. Each new pattern of depth charges crept closer, tearing through the water with deadly precision. The submarine groaned as if alive, its steel skin bending under the assault. Above, in the air, a Grumman F-4F Wildcat and a TBM Avenger from the Guadalcanal circled like hawks. They watched the surface for signs, oil slicks, bubbles, debris. Then suddenly, a patch of dark water shimmered. The U-boat was rising. Captain Lang knew his boat was finished. The hull had been breached. Electrical power was failing. He had one choice left: to save his crew. "Surface the boat," he ordered. The command echoed through the corridors. Compressed air hissed through the ballast tanks. The submarine began to climb, and then it broke the surface. To the men on the American ships, it was an astonishing sight. A German U-boat bursting from the deep like a wounded beast. Its conning tower rose above the waves, smoke and oil pouring from its vents. Crewmen stumbled out onto the deck, some jumping into the sea in panic. For the first time in years of war, an enemy submarine had surfaced alive, within reach. The USS Shetland opened fire. Machine guns raked the U-boat's deck to keep the Germans from manning their weapons. Other destroyer escorts raced closer, forming a loose circle around the crippled submarine. Aircraft dove low, marking the scene with smoke floats. Captain Gallery's mind raced. He knew this was his moment, the chance to do what no one else had done. He ordered the attack to cease. "Hold your fire." "She's abandoned. Prepare to board." It was an extraordinary command. In the middle of a naval battle, American sailors were about to board an enemy warship still afloat, still armed, and possibly ready to explode. A small boarding party was chosen from USS Pillsbury, led by Lieutenant Albert David. David was calm, steady, and brave. He gathered his men, boatswain's mate J.C. Knispel, radioman K.R. Lovelin, and several others. They knew the risks. The Germans could have left demolition charges to scuttle the submarine. There could be booby traps, flooding compartments, or hidden explosives. But they went anyway. The small whaleboat was lowered into the sea. The men rowed hard toward the listing U-boat, waves slapping against the sides. As they climbed up the conning tower, the smell of diesel and oil filled the air. The deck was slick and hot from gunfire, but no one shot back. The German crew had already jumped overboard. Lieutenant David and his men entered the submarine through the open conning tower hatch. Inside, it was chaos. Water poured through broken seals. Papers floated across the floor. The engines were still running. They could hear air hissing through valves. David moved fast. He closed the scuttling valves, stopping the flooding. Then he and his men began to search for anything valuable, code books, charts, and the most prized possession of all, the Enigma machine. Within minutes, they found it, still intact, still sitting in the control room. They grabbed it and a stack of cipher materials and carried them up to the deck. In the midst of the confusion, they managed to hoist an American flag on the submarine's periscope. A surreal moment in naval history. A German U-boat flying the stars and stripes. For hours, the Americans worked to keep the submarine afloat. Water was pumped out. Lines were thrown across to stabilize her. The USS Pillsbury took her under tow. On board the Guadalcanal, Captain Gallery watched the operation unfold with quiet satisfaction. It had worked. For the first time in more than a century, the United States Navy had captured an enemy warship on the high seas. The last time had been during the War of 1812, but the mission wasn't over yet. The U-boat was still hundreds of miles from safety. If she sank, all of their efforts would be wasted. If she exploded, the boarding party could be killed. And if the Germans discovered what had happened, the Allied code-breaking advantage could be lost. Secrecy was paramount. By nightfall, the captured U-505 was under tow, heading west toward the Cape Verde Islands. The German crew, 58 men, were rescued from the sea and taken prisoner. They were kept isolated, cut off from any chance to send word home. The United States Navy didn't want the Kriegsmarine to know that one of its submarines had been captured intact. For days, the convoy sailed slowly toward Bermuda. The captured U-boat creaked and groaned under the strain of the tow. Crewmen worked around the clock to keep her afloat. They pumped water from flooded compartments and patched leaks as best they could. The Atlantic was merciless. But somehow, she held together. Finally, after a long and perilous journey, U-505 arrived in Bermuda. There, she was hidden away inside a secret naval facility. Only a handful of people knew the truth of what had happened. The capture of U-505 was more than just a daring act of naval bravery. It was a breakthrough in intelligence. Inside the submarine, American analysts discovered detailed code books, operation orders, and a working Enigma machine. This material provided fresh insight into how the German U-boat command communicated, how convoys were targeted, and how submarine groups coordinated attacks. The information was quietly shared with Allied intelligence in Washington and London, but no announcement was made. The Germans never learned that U-505 had survived. They assumed it had been destroyed like so many others. That assumption gave the Allies a vital edge in the final phase of the Battle of the Atlantic. For his courage in leading the boarding party, Lieutenant Albert David was later awarded the Medal of Honor, the only one ever given for capturing an enemy ship in World War II. Several other sailors received the Navy Cross and other decorations, but at the time their heroism was kept secret. The operation was classified for the remainder of the war. The American sailors had done something extraordinary. They had turned the tide of history not through destruction, but through preservation. They had captured the enemy's secrets and changed the course of the undersea war. As Task Group 22.3 sailed home, the crew of the Guadalcanal could hardly believe what they had done. They had faced one of the deadliest enemies of the sea and emerged with its very heart in their hands. But the story of U-505 didn't end there. Her life as a weapon of war was over. Yet her story, the story of her capture, her secrets, and her strange new home, was only just beginning. The ocean was quiet again. Only the slow rhythm of the waves against steel. Beneath the sun, a strange sight drifted westward. a German U-boat flying an American flag. Her name was U-505, and she was no longer the hunter. She was the prize. On board the escort carrier USS Guadalcanal, Captain Daniel Five Gallery watched the captured submarine through binoculars. He knew what they had accomplished, but he also knew that this moment had to remain silent, hidden from the world. If Germany learned that one of its U-boats had been taken intact, everything the Americans had gained could vanish overnight. The enemy would change its codes, its tactics, its technology. So from the moment U-505 was taken under tow, the capture became one of the most closely guarded secrets of the entire war. In the days that followed, the Americans began their careful exploration of the submarine. Every corner was searched, every scrap of paper, every map, every mechanical device was logged and stored. Inside the cramped compartments, the air was heavy with the smell of diesel and salt water. Oil floated on the surface of the bilges. Loose tools clattered as the ship rolled. But among the wreckage lay treasures, the kind of treasures that intelligence officers dream of. On a small table near the control room, sailors found cipher logs and radio codes. Nearby, in a metal cabinet, they uncovered operation charts, U-boat Wolfpack routes, and details of German convoy intercepts. The true prize, however, sat in the radio room, the Enigma machine itself, a compact device of rotors, switches, and keys. It looked simple, but to the Allies it represented the mind of the enemy. The machine encoded Germany's most secret messages, from submarine commands to naval strategies. Though British intelligence at Bletchley Park had already broken Enigma earlier in the war, each captured machine and code book confirmed, refined, and strengthened the Allies' ability to read German signals. The capture of U-505 gave them new material, fresh rotors, new settings, and operational codes that had changed recently in the field. For Allied cryptanalysts, it was gold. In Bermuda, the submarine was hidden within a secure naval facility. The men who guarded it had orders not to speak of what they saw. The German prisoners were held in complete isolation. They were told nothing, shown nothing, and denied any contact with the outside world. Even Red Cross inspectors were kept away. The U.S. Navy went to extraordinary lengths to preserve the illusion that U-505 was gone, lost like hundreds of other submarines at the bottom of the sea. Inside Washington, the Office of Naval Intelligence handled the processing of the captured materials. The Enigma components and documents were quietly shipped to the United States. Only a small number of officers, scientists, and codebreakers were told where they came from. Reports referred to the source simply as special intercept material. The Germans never changed their naval codes that year. They couldn't. They didn't know they had been compromised. And because of that, Allied convoys moved with new confidence across the Atlantic. They could track the wolf packs before they struck. They could avoid traps. And they could strike first. The capture of U-505 shortened the Battle of the Atlantic. Not by sinking more submarines, but by seeing through their eyes. For the Americans who had taken part, life aboard the captured submarine was surreal. Many had spent years fighting an invisible enemy beneath the sea. Now they walked through its steel corridors, touched its controls, and stared at the bunks where German sailors had slept. They found small details that told human stories. Letters from home written in German script, family photographs pinned near workbenches, a Bible with salt-stained pages. These remnants reminded them that their enemies were men, not monsters, sailors who had endured the same fear, the same exhaustion, the same endless ocean. One crewman later wrote in his diary, "It was like stepping into the other side of the war. The smells, the sounds, everything was the same, only reversed. As the weeks passed, the U.S. Navy engineers began to study the submarine's technology. The Germans had developed clever innovations, advanced torpedo firing systems, radar detectors, and noise reduction equipment. American engineers examined each piece, noting differences from U.S. designs. Every valve, every lever, every sonar display became a lesson in enemy engineering. The insights gained from U-505 helped the Navy refine its own submarine tactics and designs. They learned how to make their own vessels quieter, how to jam German radar, and how to predict U-boat evasion maneuvers. It was more than a capture. It was an education in undersea warfare. Meanwhile, Captain Gallery faced his own challenge. He had achieved what no one else had dared attempt, but he knew that recognition would not come soon. The capture of U-505 remained secret even within the Navy. Many officers were told only that a submarine had been destroyed. Gallery's men were warned never to discuss what had happened. Still, pride ran deep among the crew. They had done the impossible, and they had done it without losing a single man. Gallery later wrote in his report, "Our success was not due to luck, but to training, discipline, and the courage of men who believed the impossible could be done." His words were modest but true. The operation had required precision. Every maneuver, every decision timed perfectly. Had they waited even a few minutes longer, U-505 would have been scuttled and lost forever. The German crew, meanwhile, remained prisoners in silence. For months they were held in a special camp, forbidden from writing letters or receiving news. They didn't learn the truth until long after the war had ended, that their submarine had not been sunk, but displayed as a captured trophy. Captain Harold Lang, who had been wounded during the attack, was treated with respect by his captors. Despite being the enemy, the Americans admired his discipline and his willingness to surrender rather than die needlessly. After the war, Lang would quietly return to Germany. His naval career ended, his story largely untold. In 1945, as the war drew to a close, the secret of U-505 was finally revealed to the world. Newspapers carried the headline, "U.S. Navy captures German submarine intact." Photographs of the boat, still scarred and rusting, appeared on front pages across America. For many readers, it seemed almost unbelievable that a U-boat had been captured alive in combat. The timing of the revelation was deliberate. By then, Germany had surrendered. There was no longer any risk that the information would aid the enemy. And the U.S. Navy wanted to celebrate the achievement publicly to show what its sailors had done. Lieutenant Albert David, who had led the boarding party, received the Medal of Honor posthumously as he had died in a training accident shortly after the war. His calm bravery that day on the Atlantic became a symbol of quiet heroism. Other members of the task group received the Navy Cross, the Silver Star, and commendations for valor. But perhaps their greatest reward was knowing that their mission had mattered, that the risks they had taken in those few desperate minutes had saved countless lives. After the war, U-505's fate took a surprising turn. The Navy had no use for her as a weapon, but she had become something more, a piece of history. For several years, the submarine was used for training and inspection at various naval yards. Sailors and engineers studied her design, tested her systems, and learned from her construction. Eventually, she was scheduled for scrapping. Her steel was to be melted down. Her story ended. But Captain Gallery, now a respected admiral, had another idea. He wanted to preserve her as a monument, a reminder of the men who had fought in the Atlantic and of the daring capture that had defined his career. Gallery approached the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago, his hometown, with a proposal to bring U-505 to the museum as a permanent exhibit. It was an enormous challenge. The submarine was 252 feet long and weighed over 750 tons. Moving her from the East Coast to the Great Lakes required complex logistics, a journey that spanned rivers, canals, and even city streets. But in 1954, after months of planning, the impossible was done once again. U-505 arrived in Chicago. Thousands of people lined the streets to watch the strange procession, a German submarine rolling through the heart of America. For the first time, civilians could walk inside a real U-boat, see its machinery, and imagine the lives of the men who had fought within it. Children touched the steel hull that had once defied Allied convoys. Veterans stood silently, remembering the friends they had lost to the sea. U-505 had become more than a relic. She was a bridge between enemies, a reminder of courage on both sides. Today, she still rests in Chicago, preserved in a specially built underground hall, protected from weather and time. Visitors walk through her narrow corridors, past the engines and torpedo tubes, the cramped bunks and control panels. The smell of oil and metal still lingers faintly in the air. Plaques tell her story, her 12 patrols, her 8 victories, her capture by Task Group 22.3, her long journey from warship to museum. Every year, veterans and historians gather there to remember not only the men who captured her, but also those who once served aboard her. The ocean that divided them now joins them in memory. The capture of U-505 remains one of the most remarkable naval events of the Second World War. It was not won by superior numbers or overwhelming firepower, but by skill, timing, and daring. It showed that courage could coexist with restraint, that sometimes victory lies not in destruction, but in preservation. Through one act of audacity, the United States Navy turned a symbol of terror into a symbol of triumph. They stole the enemy's weapon, his secrets, and, in a sense, his story. And in doing so, they helped shorten the longest and most dangerous battle of the war, the Battle of the Atlantic. The Atlantic War ended long ago. The convoys no longer sail in fear. The sonar screens are silent now. But the story of U-505 still echoes through history, through the steel hull preserved in Chicago, and through the lessons she left behind. For the men who captured her, the memory never faded. To them, it was more than a mission. It was a moment that defined what courage, intelligence, and discipline could achieve together. For the world, it became a symbol that even in a war built on destruction, there were acts that preserved knowledge instead of erasing it. When Captain Daniel Vist-Gallery reflected on the events of June 4, 1944, he described them not as an accident of luck, but as the result of human determination. He often said that the capture of U-505 was possible only because of preparation, months of training, endless drills, and the faith that his men had in each other. He knew what it meant to fight an invisible enemy. He had seen ships vanish without a trace, lives swallowed by the ocean. For him, the capture was more than revenge. It was a turning point, a message to every sailor that the U-boats could be beaten, not just destroyed, but taken from the sea itself. The intelligence gathered from U-505 continued to influence Allied strategy even after her secrets were officially analyzed. The documents helped refine the Navy's understanding of German communications networks. The Enigma materials confirmed what British and American cryptanalysts had been decoding for months and added new data that helped anticipate final U-boat movements during 1944 and 1945. Every intercepted message, every avoided attack carried a shadow of that moment when Lieutenant Albert David stepped into the flooded submarine and turned the valves that kept it alive. The impact of that decision, made in seconds, rippled across oceans. When the war ended, the world entered a new era, the Cold War. The U.S. Navy faced a new kind of submarine threat, this time from the Soviet Union. Yet many of the men and engineers who studied U-505 systems carried forward what they had learned from her. Her captured technology, from battery layouts to periscope designs, influenced post-war research. American engineers examined the strengths and flaws of the German U-boat and used those insights to design faster, quieter submarines for the nuclear age. Even the training manuals used by the U.S. Navy's submarine schools in the late 1940s and 1950s still contained lessons drawn from U-505 structure and operations. In this way, the captured U-boat continued to serve the country that had once hunted her. But perhaps the greatest legacy of U-505 is not military at all. It is human. Every person who walks through her steel corridors today steps into a world that was once real, the claustrophobic mechanical heart of undersea warfare. The cramped bunks, the narrow hatches, the smell of oil and machinery, they tell a story no textbook can. She has become a time capsule, preserving the fear, the discipline, and the strange brotherhood of men who fought both the enemy and the sea. Visitors walk her decks in silence. They see the dials still set as they were in 1944. They imagine the thunder of depth charges, the tilt of the hull, the shouts of men closing valves and sealing doors. It is history you can touch, and it humbles those who do. For historians, U-505 represents one of the most extraordinary naval captures in modern history. It remains the only German submarine taken intact by the Allies during the Second World War. Not a single man was killed in the capture, and the prize yielded intelligence that helped secure the Atlantic routes on which victory depended. Admiral Gallery later wrote in his memoirs, "Some called it luck. I call it faith in the men and in the Navy that trained them." He spent much of his later life ensuring that U-505 would be preserved for future generations, not as a symbol of conquest, but as a teacher of courage, discipline, and restraint. Over the years, the submarine's presence in Chicago became something unexpected, a quiet point of reconciliation. Former American sailors visited to remember their victory. German veterans came too, to remember their fallen comrades. And in the dim light of the museum's display hall, they often stood side by side, silent, reflective, united by the same sea that had once divided them. It is said that when one German visitor stood before the submarine's hull, he whispered only 3 words, "Sie hat überlebt." She survived, and that, in its own way, was true. The lessons of U-505 reach beyond war. They remind us that even in the darkest conflicts, humanity's greatest strength lies not only in the will to fight, but in the will to understand, to preserve, to learn. Her story teaches that curiosity can be as powerful as courage, that victory can come not from destruction, but from restraint and intellect. When Lieutenant Albert David closed those flooding valves, he saved more than a submarine. He preserved a story, one that would teach future generations about the cost of war and the value of daring to do what seems impossible. Today, more than 80 years later, U-505 remains frozen in time. Beneath the soft museum lights, her steel glows faintly. Children press their hands against the cool metal. Veterans bow their heads. Historians trace the faded numbers on her hull. She carries scars, bullet holes, rust, and patches where her skin was torn by depth charges. But those scars are her medals. They speak of survival. For the United States Navy, the capture of U-505 stands as one of its proudest traditions. It embodies precision, courage, and the unity of purpose that defined the generation who fought the Second World War. Each year, the Navy honors the memory of Task Group 22.3 and its commander, Daniel Gallery. Their success reminds sailors that no enemy, no matter how hidden, is beyond the reach of determination and skill. For the men who were there, the pilots, the destroyer crews, the boarding party, the Atlantic that day was a test of everything they had trained for, and they passed it with quiet perfection. When the ocean closed over the last wrecks of the U-boat fleet in 1945, the war beneath the waves finally ended. But in that vast graveyard, one survivor lived on, not as a threat, but as a teacher. U-505, the submarine that refused to die, the enemy that became a relic, the weapon that became a witness. In the stillness of the museum, her story continues to whisper, a story of men who dared the impossible, of a sea that tested them, and of a moment when courage met opportunity and changed the course of the war. The Atlantic is calm now, but the echoes remain. And if you listen closely, you can still hear the heartbeat of the submarine they called U-505